The cleaner only wanted an autograph. The legend offered a smile. But what happened next exposed more than corporate policy. It revealed a system built to erase. A single request became a spark, and when the face on the billboard found out what was done in that name, silence was no longer an option. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The floors of Harmonic's corporate plaza gleamed like liquid glass beneath the morning sun. From the 74th floor down to the lobby, every surface sparkled with the kind of cleanliness that came not from machines or fancy tech, but from people like Delora Price, invisible hands and tired backs. Delora, 47, moved silently with her cart, gray streaks running through her once coal-black hair, the rhythm of her work shaped by years of being seen only when something was wrong. Today she had started early. Something about the air told her it wasn't going to be just another shift. Delora kept her head low, her badge clipped to a fading hoodie, her gloves worn at the palms. She had memorized every office she was allowed in, every corridor she was supposed to stay out of. That was the unspoken code at Harmonix. Clean, but don't be seen. The elevator doors slid open at the executive level. Normally Delora wouldn't be here, but a spill had been reported in the South Conference hallway. As she made her way, mop in hand, she noticed a quiet stir, more security, more noise than usual. Something, or someone important was here. That's when she saw him. Shaquille O'Neal. He was taller than she remembered from the television. Towering, yes, but not in a way that made others small. There was something warm in the way he moved, something soft tucked into the fold of his towering presence. He wasn't here for the board. He was here for a charity partnership with Harmonix's philanthropic arm. Harmonix Hope, a photo op, the kind where people clapped and nothing really changed. But to Delora he wasn't just a public figure. He was the last happy memory of her son, Darius. Darius had adored Shaq. Posters, jerseys, recorded interviews, the whole bit. Even during chemo, he'd watched old NBA reruns, and whispered, "One day, I'll shake that man's hand." That day never came. Darius passed at 17, hospital neglected to run a test on time, called it standard delay. Delora never forgot, never forgave. And now, here he was. Not on a screen, not behind a fence at an event, right here. Shaq turned, caught her glance, and smiled, the kind of effortless grin that made the world seem like it could still be good. She hesitated, one hand still on the mop handle. Her throat tightened. It wasn't about the autograph. It was about remembering her boy. She stepped forward, heart hammering. "Excuse me, sir," she said, soft but steady. I don't mean to interrupt. My son. He was a big fan. He would have loved to meet you. If it ain't too much, could I trouble you for an autograph?" Shaq's face softened. He nodded once and reached for the pen in his pocket. That's when it happened. A woman in a sharp, pinstriped suit appeared out of nowhere. Vivian Murch, operations floor manager, eyes scanning like radar. She didn't even look at Shaq. Her eyes were on Delora, tight, cold, mechanical. "Miss Price," she said sharply. "Your shift is on a restricted floor. You're not authorized for direct engagement with guests." Delora blinked. This is not a matter for discussion. Come with me, please." Shaq raised a hand. "Hey, it's cool." But Vivian had already stepped between them. A quiet nod sending two security guards into motion, not to escort Delora out physically, but enough presence to make it feel like a threat. Shaq stepped back, puzzled, watching as Delora was led down the hallway. His gut said to follow, but a PR assistant tugged at his arm. "We're late for the presentation, Mr. O'Neal." Delora said nothing as she walked. She didn't fight. She'd seen this before, the escalation that always happened when she didn't comply immediately. She'd seen others, mostly those who looked like her, fired for less. A misplaced word, a missed cue. Inside a small operations office, Vivian closed the door. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This building operates on visibility control," she said, folding her hands. "Your behavior today could have compromised a corporate image event. Your employment is being terminated effective immediately. HR will process the papers. You will receive 2 weeks severance." Delora opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "We expect discretion," Vivian added, like it was an afterthought. Delora stepped out 30 minutes later with a plastic bag holding her badge, her locker key, and a faded thank you card from a manager who'd left 5 years ago. She stood outside the building, sunlight burning into the tears she didn't want anyone to see. For a moment she looked back, not at the building, but at the elevator bay, wondering if Shaq ever knew what happened, wondering if she should have just kept walking. What she didn't know was that Vivian had already logged the termination as boundary violation, unauthorized engagement with brand-affiliated guest. It was all legal. On paper it was clean. In reality it was something else. It wasn't just about a smile, or a signature. It was about a system that punished people for being human. A system that didn't like mess, didn't like real. As Shaq delivered his speech on the 47th floor, smiling before a wall of executives and flashing cameras, Delora waited at a bus stop, clutching her son's photo in her jacket pocket, trying not to fall apart. The city moved on like nothing happened. Inside Harmonics, no one whispered about the firing. No one asked questions. But systems like that, they always leave traces. And someone somewhere in that tower had noticed. The cameras saw more than they should have. And Shaq later that night, while scrolling through his foundation's inbox, would find a letter with no subject line. It would begin with a name he didn't know, and end with one he couldn't forget. Talon Briggs always entered a room like he owned the air. His suits were tailored to precision, his expressions never too eager, never too hard. A cool calm lived in his voice, the kind that made people lean in just enough without realizing they were being measured. As the vice president of image and investor relations at Harmonics, Talon didn't move products, he moved perception, and he believed in a world so clean it frightened the truth into hiding. Inside his corner office on the 62nd floor, glass walls on two sides, art chosen to appear progressive, but neutral. Talon tapped his stylus against a sleek digital tablet. The termination form for Delora Price hovered on screen. His signature flicked on with practiced ease, as if he were swiping away a smudge on a mirror. A single sentence in the HR file summed it up. Employee crossed professional boundaries by engaging a brand-affiliated guest. He didn't feel anything as he approved it. Not guilt, not even a whisper of second thought. Talon believed in clean optics. In his view, brand identity was not just about logos and taglines. It was about who got seen and who stayed invisible. Everything in Harmonics' public image had to be aspirational, polished, and free of what he privately referred to as visual liabilities. That meant anyone who didn't fit the mold, too poor, too outspoken, too culturally bold, too brown, too black, was quietly rotated out under the careful cover of performance issues or administrative reshuffling. He didn't fire people for who they were. He simply made their presence feel unaligned. And now, Shaquille O'Neal, charity mogul, NBA legend, the people's giant, was walking directly into Talon's curated world. Shaq had always been a brand-friendly icon, funny, approachable, massive but soft, around the edges. He was perfect. Talon had spent the past 3 months orchestrating his company's philanthropic alignment with Shaq's foundation. On paper, it was all about neighborhood revitalization and educational equity. In practice, Talon only cared about the headlines. Harmonics partners with Shaquille O'Neal to empower communities. Shaq's smile was being printed on billboards. His voice was spliced into Harmonics' recruitment ads, and his name was stamped across press packets that landed on investor desks nationwide. It was perfect synergy. That's what made the Delora incident so inconvenient. Talon had watched the footage from the security cam outside conference hall. Delora's face was visible, looking up at Shaq. Her posture was polite, timid, even. Shaq had leaned in, friendly, and casual. No disruption, no disorder. But it wasn't about what happened. It was about what might have happened. What could be spun by the wrong person in the wrong direction. He had trained his team to act preemptively. Vivian Murch, his most loyal operations manager, had done exactly what she was supposed to do. She saw the infraction unauthorized employee initiating personal engagement with a high-profile guest and moved immediately to neutralize it. Talon didn't even have to be consulted. By the time he was briefed, the decision had already been implemented. He simply signed what had already been executed. It had to be done. One misstep, one snapshot of a cleaner getting too comfortable with a celebrity guest, and the brand narrative could derail. Investors didn't like ambiguity. They liked stability. Delora Price had become a variable, and variables were meant to be managed, not understood. As Talon stared at her name in the system, He clicked over to the internal turnover logs. A quiet smile touched his lips. It was working. In the past 2 years, under his guidance, Harmonix's internal visual consistency rating had improved by 47%. That meant fewer complaints about awkward appearances in company marketing, smoother investor presentations, and a tighter media image. The unofficial side effect of the last 26 non-executive dismissals, under the category brand violation, 19 were either Black or Latino. But Talon had structured the system so carefully that each one came with a footnoted justification: lateness, overstepping, attitude. No red flags, no lawsuits, just numbers, rebranded as facts. As far as the board was concerned, he was streamlining the culture. And now he had Shaq, willing, smiling, and large enough to cast a long shadow over any uncomfortable truths. No one would suspect racism inside a company that partnered with one of the most beloved black icons in America. No one would question subtle patterns when the face of their campaign was Big Shaq himself. That was the brilliance of it all. Shaq didn't know. He probably never would. Talon's phone buzzed. A message from Vivian. Cleaner escorted off-site. Termination processed. No disturbance. He replied with a thumbs up, then turned to his window, gazing out at the skyline. From this height, the city looked like a clean spreadsheet, blocks of movement, tidy, and in place. He liked it that way. But what Talon didn't know, what he couldn't see from that glass tower, was that something had shifted, something tiny, a tremor in the system. An intern named Jace Mercer had been on floor 42 that morning, compiling exit files for archiving. He wasn't part of the usual HR crew. He wasn't trained to skim and ignore, and he'd stumbled across a physical letter tucked inside an outgoing personnel folder, folded like it was never meant to be found. No header, no logo, just ink on paper, and heartbreak in every line. The letter was written by Delora Price. It hadn't been required. It wasn't part of the protocol. It was just something she'd done while waiting in the HR lobby, writing not to protest but to explain. Jace had read it once, then twice, and then he'd broken every rule in the employee handbook by slipping a copy into his personal satchel before finishing the archiving batch. He didn't know Delora, had never even seen her face, but the letter made something impossible to ignore. She had a son, Darius, had cancer, treated like a number in the same hospital. Harmonix had promised to renovate through its Hope initiative. Delora had seen Shaq as more than a celebrity. She'd seen him as a symbol of all the strength her son clung to while dying in a system that never saw him. That autograph was never for her. It was for a boy already gone. And she was fired for asking. Talon wouldn't find out about the letter. Not yet. Not until it was far too late to unwrite what had been written. Back in his office, Talon began organizing documents for the next board review. Stat sheets, image metrics, digital ad impressions. Harmonix's quarterly image report projected a 3.2% bump in audience favorability. Investors would be pleased. Nobody would mention the cleaner. Nobody would even remember her name. And Shaq? As long as he kept smiling, as long as the photo shoots hit their mark, Talon could keep spinning silence into success. But systems, no matter how clean they seem, don't last forever. Especially not when the face on the billboard starts asking questions. Delora didn't go home right away. The dismissal had come too fast, too cold, leaving her standing in the street outside Harmonix, with her life packed in a plastic bag. For 20 minutes, she sat on a bus bench, unmoving, staring down at her hands like they weren't hers. She didn't cry, not yet. She couldn't. Instead, she fumbled in her jacket pocket, pulled out the crumpled photo of Darius, a school picture, age 15, bright grin, missing tooth, the last smile before the doctors started talking in percentages. She looked up at the Harmonix building, its mirrored glass reflecting the city like it didn't owe anyone anything. Delora knew the world didn't hand out fairness, but what burned was that she hadn't done anything wrong. All she'd done was ask. One kind moment, one sentence, and now it was all gone. By the time she stepped into her small studio apartment in Lowridge, the numbness had settled into her bones. She set the bag down, pulled off her shoes, and sat at the tiny kitchen table that had once been Darius's homework station. Her eyes wandered across the room, landing on the unopened mail, the dusty shelf of Darius's old books, the faded poster of Shaq he'd pinned above his bed. For a moment, her throat tightened. She pulled out a blank page from a drawer. Old resume paper, left over from the time she'd tried applying to reception jobs, and began to write. Not a complaint, not a plea. A story. Her story. her son's story, and why that one moment, asking for an autograph, had carried the weight of a lifetime. She wrote about hospital waiting rooms, where doctors looked past them, where questions went unanswered until it was too late. She wrote about Darius watching Shaq interviews on her old tablet, while his IV dripped silently beside him. She wrote about how he mimicked Shaq's deep voice to make the nurses laugh. How he'd said, "Mom, if I ever meet him, I'm gonna give him a big man hug," and how she'd smiled through the fear. And she wrote about the moment Shaq looked at her. How kind his face was, how safe it felt, and how quickly it was taken away. It wasn't anger. She poured onto the page. It was grief, and something quieter, a longing for dignity, for someone to just hear her. She didn't know where to send the letter at first. But tucked in Darius's things was a pamphlet from the Shaquille O'Neal Foundation, a charity they had once applied to for scholarship aid. On the back in small print was a mailing address for general inquiry. She folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and added a return address she knew she'd never hear from. Then she walked to the mailbox down the block, and let it go. Days passed. Silence, as always, followed. But inside the Harmonics Tower, something unexpected happened. The letter never reached Shaq. At least not right away. It had been intercepted during HR's outgoing mail review, flagged as non-essential documentation related to personnel separation. It was logged, scanned, and placed in folder 291H, the digital bin for process terminations. No one was meant to read it again. Until Jace Mercer did. Jace had been at Harmonics for only 3 weeks, a digital archives intern brought on through a university partnership. Young, cautious, always double-checking names before sending emails. He had no authority. Just a desk wedged between supply shelves and a tablet scanner. Most days were spent digitizing severance files, uploading expense reports, and redacting ID numbers. It was a quiet job, the kind that never invited attention. But Jace wasn't like the others. He had grown up in a small working-class suburb of Milwaukee, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings in silence. He knew what invisibility looked like. And when folder 291H came across his docket for processing, he opened it like all the others, until he saw the file labeled personal letter, not for upload. His thumb hovered over the delete icon. Company policy was clear. But something about the way personal was underlined in pen made him hesitate. He opened the file and read once, then again. By the third read, his hands were shaking. Jace didn't cry easily. But by the time he reached the last paragraph, where Delora wrote that she only asked for the autograph because her son had believed the world still held kindness, he was crying in the storage room, biting his sleeve so no one would hear. He stared at the screen, caught in a decision that no training manual could cover. By all logic, he should close the file, log it, and move on. But his conscience wouldn't let him. He took out his phone and searched the Shaquille O'Neal Foundation. Not the media email, not the PR team. He looked deeper through alumni messages and donor correspondence. Buried in an old basketball camp announcement from 2 years back, he found an alternate contact, legacy at shaqfoundation.org. He opened a blank message, attached the scanned letter, and typed just 3 words in the subject line. "You need to see this." Then, without allowing himself time to overthink, he hit send. For the rest of the day, Jace moved through his tasks like a ghost. No one noticed anything unusual. HR continued filtering files. Vivian Murch continued scheduling floor audits. Talon Briggs met with branding consultants. And somewhere in a secure inbox, the letter began its quiet journey to a man who had no idea how much had been hidden in his name. Jace didn't tell anyone what he had done. Not his roommate. Not his supervisor. He didn't even save a copy for himself. He just knew deep in his gut that the woman who wrote those words deserved more than the silence she'd been handed. That night, he walked past the Harmonics Plaza on his way home, and paused, staring up at the massive banner featuring Shaq's face, lit up across the windows. He wondered if a man that big could hear something as small as a whisper written in grief. The next morning, Shaq's foundation director would open the message flagged as priority, and within 48 hours, the letter would be sitting on Shaq's desk, beside a cup of coffee he'd forget to finish. But for now, the world continued on. And somewhere, far below the noise of corporate boardrooms and investor calls, a buried truth had just begun to stir. The early morning light spilled through the tall windows of Shaq's personal office, a quiet corner of his foundation headquarters in Atlanta, far from press events, away from the polished narratives that lived in boardrooms and filtered interviews. The room was calm, designed not for show but for reflection. No trophies on display, just a few photographs. His mother Lucille, his kids, a faded photo of himself standing outside his childhood home in Newark, holding a basketball too big for his young hands. Shaq sat at his desk, thumbing through the final prep packet for his upcoming keynote at the Harmonix Hope Initiative launch. It was meant to be a victory lap, a celebration of corporate partnership and community transformation, the kind of polished event where he showed up, smiled for photos, gave a speech about education and opportunity, and quietly returned to real work when the cameras turned off. But this morning, something different waited for him. His assistant, Marcella, had left a note on top of the folder stack. Flagged "This for you" came in through legacy inbox. Not screened. He opened the message with mild curiosity, expecting a long-winded funding proposal, or a fan mail, addressed to the wrong department. Instead, he found a scan of a handwritten letter, crease marks and all, bearing the name Delora Price. The first few lines slowed his breath. By the halfway point, he stopped reading and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. By the end, he was gripping the paper like it might break apart in his hands. He read it again, and again. There was no request, no demand, just honesty, written in plain, tired words. Delora's son, Darius, had believed in him. Not the celebrity version of him, but the man he tried to be when nobody watched. Her voice didn't tremble on the page, but it carried weight, real weight. She had asked for an autograph, not because of fame, but because Shaq had been one of the last pieces of hope her boy clung to. And then she lost her job for it. Shaq stared at the wall. A memory rose. His mother Lucille, wiping her hands on an apron, after cleaning office floors late at night, telling him with pride that no job was beneath them, that dignity didn't come from what you did, it came from how you did it. He heard her voice clearly now. If somebody notices you working hard, don't flinch. Stand taller. Delora had stood tall, and the system had erased her in a blink. His fingers tightened. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. But a quiet anger coiled in his chest, not just at what had happened, but at the creeping realization that it had happened in his name. His smiling face was on Harmonix's banners, their community promise brochures, their PR campaigns. His name had granted them credibility, access, trust. And while they were using him to sell hope, they were gutting it from the people who needed it most. He tapped the intercom. "Marcella, clear my afternoon. I need to take a drive." 2 hours later, Shaq's SUV rolled through Low Ridge, the neighborhood listed in Delora's letter as her residence. He wore a plain hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low, the way he always did when he wanted anonymity, but still got recognized by at least 2 out of 10 people. Today, no one stopped him. Low Ridge didn't have the kind of foot traffic that paused for celebrities. He drove past cracked sidewalks, shuttered shops, a rec center that looked half-gutted, and an empty building that once bore a mural of smiling children. It had been funded by Harmonix Hope 2 years ago. Now it stood vacant, windows dusted with grime. At a corner store, he bought a soda and lingered by the register. "Used to be a clinic round here, right?" he asked the cashier, a man with tired eyes and a name tag that read Len. Len shrugged. "Used to. They gutted it. Said the renovation funds fell through. Heard it was Harmonix money. Never saw a brick laid. People got sent across the city for anything serious after that." Shaq nodded, thanked him, and stepped back outside. He pulled out his phone and dug through his own foundation's community initiative files, ones Harmonix had promised to co-fund. The documents painted a perfect picture. The clinic had been budgeted, approved and finalized. $100,000 had supposedly gone to hospital upgrades right here in Low Ridge, except nothing existed. He felt the pit settle deeper in his stomach. Delora's letter hadn't said where Darius passed, but the timeline matched. If he'd gone to that clinic or had nowhere else to go, and died waiting for care that never arrived, then Harmonix hadn't just fired his mother. They'd failed her son, and Shaq by extension had let them. Not on purpose, not knowingly. But in the world of corporate hands and smiling press releases, silence is sometimes louder than complicity. Back at the SUV, he sat for a long time with the engine off, eyes staring ahead. His face, so often the source of joy in others, now felt like a lie. He had been used, not just as a face, but as a shield. Cover for a company masking exclusion as professionalism. He remembered something his mother once told him after a tough loss in high school ball, when a coach blamed him for a play that wasn't his fault. The world's gonna put your name on things that don't belong to you, baby. What matters is what you're willing to take it off of. He whispered to himself. Time to take it off. Before leaving Low Ridge, he parked outside the worn-down school where the youth center had once been promised. A group of teenagers loitered near the entrance, laughing, trying to stay out of trouble while surrounded by it. He rolled down the window. "This the old Dixon wreck?" he asked. A boy stepped forward. "Used to be. Now it's just nothing. You ever hear of harmonics?" The kid laughed, shaking his head. "Only when they needed us for that photo thing. Had us all wear shirts for a week. Then they bounced." Shaq nodded. "Yeah," he said, mostly to himself. "That sounds about right." He didn't say his name. Didn't need to. Not yet. He drove off with one destination in mind. His mother's house. Lucille O'Neill opened the door before he even knocked, like she'd felt his presence. Her smile dropped the moment she saw his face. What happened? He stepped inside, sat on the same couch he'd flopped onto, as a teenager after long practices. The walls hadn't changed, still filled with photos, still filled with truth. He handed her the printed letter. Lucille read it in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were sharp. Not surprised, just disappointed. "You didn't know," she said. "I should've," he replied. "I should've paid attention." She placed a hand over his. "Then pay attention now." That night, Shaq sat in his study and reopened the harmonics files. Every deal, every donation, every community project. He marked every initiative tied to his name. By midnight, he had a list of 12 discrepancies. Projects half-funded, facilities shuttered, promises undone. At 3:17 a.m., he sent a message to his foundation's executive team. "No more auto approvals. We're freezing all joint projects with harmonics until further audit. Schedule a meeting with legal." The next day, the media still saw Shaq smiling in ads. But beneath that smile, something had changed. He wasn't just a face anymore. He was watching. And the silence that had served others for so long, it was about to break. From the moment Shaq's foundation posted the open letter campaign, an emotionally direct but carefully unspecific statement on the silent mistreatment of underpaid workers in corporate branded charity spaces, the digital metrics at Harmonics started showing what Talon Briggs hated most. In lines. PR traction slowed. Investor sentiment shifted from confident to cautious. And worst of all, people were asking questions he couldn't control. The statement hadn't named Harmonics. Not directly, but the phrasing, the timing, and the visual of Shaq standing beside a blank wall, where a community center should have been. It hit like a whisper louder than any scream. Inside his private office, Talon stood before a massive screen displaying brand data, the same glowing dashboard that had always comforted him. Until now, his once steady audience heat maps were flickering. Mentions of Harmonics' hope were being tied to user posts demanding transparency. No scandal had broken, but the anticipation of one was growing like smoke under a closed door. He narrowed his eyes at a single blip on the engagement thread. A name he hadn't noticed before: Jace Mercer. Talon tapped the screen. "Pull up personnel logs for interns. Digital archives. Filter last 4 weeks." Jace's name came up instantly, attached to 2 flagged activities. Nothing serious, nothing obvious, but one note triggered a gut instinct. An entry labeled File Access Override, Folder 29-1. H. The folder from the Delora Price termination. Talon's instincts didn't miss much. That was his survival skill. He noticed before anyone else realized noticing was needed. Within the hour, Jace was summoned to a quiet glass-walled conference room. No HR, no witnesses. Just Talon waiting. Tie loosened but smile tight. "Have a seat, Jace." Jace complied, unsure of why the room felt colder than it should have. "You've been doing good work," Talon began. Fingers steepled. "Sharp. Thorough. Proactive." A pause. "Which is why I find it odd you'd be spending time in files you weren't assigned." Jace hesitated. "I was consolidating termination logs. Some of the folders weren't properly indexed. You accessed personal correspondence that wasn't in your scope," Talon said, voice still pleasant. "And then there was an anonymous submission to the Shaquille O'Neal Foundation. Just so happens the timing lines up exactly with a post that's been disrupting our partnership momentum." The words weren't loud, but they landed like bricks. "I don't know what you're suggesting, sir," Jace said, voice barely steady. Talon leaned in slightly. "I'm suggesting that interns with integrity survive in this industry. The others become examples. You don't want to be an example, Jace. He let that sit. Then, with a dismissive smile, stood up and left the room. No need to fire him. Fear worked better when it wasn't officially documented. What Talon didn't know was that Jace had already deleted every trace of the letter's movement. No metadata. No digital fingerprint. His mistake had been moral, not procedural, and now he knew the stakes were bigger than he'd imagined. While Talon tightened his grip, another player stepped quietly onto the board. Kendra Vale, one of Harmonix's only senior board members who wasn't handpicked by Talon's executive filter. Kendra had been on the board for 7 years. Her early votes had supported the expansion of Harmonix Hope, believing in its potential. But over time she had learned the cost of idealism. In a room full of calculated ambition, she had spoken up less and less, eventually burying her instincts beneath layers of corporate professionalism. Her silence had become armor. Until now. Shaq had requested a private meeting, not through PR, not through channels. He sent her a handwritten note, delivered through a mutual contact. Just 6 words. They told me you might know. The rooftop of the Harmonix building was usually reserved for client events, cocktail mixers, and the occasional overproduced product launch. But today, it was empty. The wind was sharp, and the sky overcast, casting everything in a colorless blur. Kendra waited near the edge, hair pulled back, coat buttoned high. Shaq stepped onto the rooftop quietly. No entourage, no assistants, just him. I appreciate you coming, she said. I'm done pretending not to see things, he replied. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Kendra exhaled, her breath visible. Delora Price, she said softly. She wasn't the first. Shaq turned to her, jaw clenched. There were others? He asked. Kendra nodded. 11 before her. I didn't realize the pattern at first. They were just names on terminations. Quiet firings. But when I pushed for internal review, Talon buried it under confidentiality, brushed it off as coincidence. But I knew. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat. It was handwritten, not a report, a list. 12 names, she said, mostly janitorial, clerical, low visibility roles, all terminated over 2 years. All non-white, all labeled brand disruption or internal misalignment. Shaq scanned the names. None were familiar. That made it worse. I thought I was helping, he muttered. You were, Kendra said, but they used your image as a disguise. A gust of wind pushed past them. Neither flinched. What do you want to do with this, she asked. I want to burn the disguise, he said. From the inside. Kendra looked him in the eye. Then you'll need more than a letter and a list. You'll need a witness, a record, something that turns their silence into your sound. Shaq nodded slowly. Then we start with Delora. As they walked back toward the stairwell, Kendra added one final thing. You think they're scared of a lawsuit, she said. They're not. They're scared of the one thing they can't unspin. What's that? Your story. That night, Talon prepared his next press strategy. Unaware that 2 floors below, Kendra had filed an official board request for full transparency audit of internal employment practices. And unaware still that Shaq had just quietly retained his own team of independent legal and social research analysts to conduct a mirror investigation. The machine was still running, but for the first time, it had started to grind. Shaquille O'Neal had always been a man of presence on the court, in commercials on talk shows and charity stages. But in the days following his rooftop meeting with Kendra Vale, something about him shifted. The usual light in his public persona dimmed, not with anger, but with deliberate restraint. Where most would raise their voice, he chose silence, not the kind that submits, but the kind that studies the room, tracks the exits, and waits for the right moment to move. The first move was small. His foundation pulled out of a scheduled co-branded event with Harmonix Hope, a high-profile gala meant to showcase corporate partnerships in underserved neighborhoods. No press statement, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet email from his team to Harmonix PR. Scheduling conflict. Mr. O'Neal will not attend. The second move followed 2 days later. Shaq's media team removed all Harmonix references from his foundation's community initiative pages. No interviews, no commentary, just code edits and archive tags vanishing from the web. Social media noticed. Journalists sniffed a story. Inside Harmonix, meetings turned tense, especially with Talon Briggs sensing a narrative slipping beyond his grip. But Shaq didn't respond to questions. When reporters asked, he offered no quotes. When analysts speculated, He offered no corrections. He starved the machine of attention, letting the silence grow thick and unnatural. Instead, Shaq focused his energies somewhere else. He rerouted funding to direct action community hubs programs without corporate filters, without polished taglines. He quietly funded the reopening of 3 neighborhood rec centers that had been promised but never delivered. In Low Ridge, the same forgotten district where Delora Price lived, and where her son had died, a new youth tech lab opened, completely anonymous in branding, but fully equipped and paid for in cash by an untraceable donor that everyone with half a brain knew had a massive shoe size. At one center, a mural of a young boy named Darius was painted on the back wall by volunteers who only knew his story through whispers. Above it, someone stenciled the phrase, "See the ones they erased." As this work spread underground, Harmonix tried to tighten their grip above it. Talon called emergency PR meetings. The buzz around Shaq's silent pullout was growing too loud to ignore. "He's pivoting," one communications exec said nervously. "It's not just that he's backing out, he's doing it strategically, and it's resonating." Still, Talon remained composed. "He has no proof, just emotion. As long as we stay clean on record, he can't touch us." That assumption cracked the moment Jace Mercer reappeared. After his thinly veiled threat from Talon, Jace didn't return to work. He knew his time was limited. A week later, his badge access was cut, and a formal termination notice arrived in the mail, citing unauthorized access to confidential personnel archives. There was no hearing, no appeal, just a form letter and silence. But Jace had already made his decision. He had copied one final batch of files, one that no one had noticed him flagging before his departure. He hadn't looked at them yet, afraid of what they might contain. But after a week of watching Shaq move with precision, after seeing the story grow without spectacle, Jace decided to do something most wouldn't dare. He delivered it by hand. Late one evening, Shaq's home assistant, Marcella, found a plain manila envelope leaning against the front gate of his Atlanta property. Taped to it was a sticky note. "You don't know me, but I read her letter first. They kept more than you think. Please read this when you're alone." Inside was a USB. Shaq didn't open it that night. He waited until the house was quiet, until he could think without distraction. Then he plugged the USB into his personal laptop, the one unconnected to any cloud system or outside network. The files were organized by HR logs dating back 5 years. Dozens of entries. But it was one folder that made his breath catch. Brand Risk Index, Visual Compliance, Internal Use Only. The contents were gutting. Each entry logged employees terminated under the company's internal policy tracking visual and cultural presentation. Notes like, employee presented with accentuated cultural attire, non-conforming to corporate brand palette. Engaged guest with unsolicited personal anecdote. Behavior flagged as potentially distracting. Hair non-compliant with uniform aesthetic. Repeat occurrence. High emotional visibility during shifts. Counterproductive to minimalist workplace experience. And beside these entries, a breakdown by race, gender, and role classification. Over 80% of those flagged under visual non-alignment were Black or Latino employees. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't chaos. It was structure. And Shaq saw with crystal clarity that Delora hadn't been an anomaly. She was a box on a checklist, a calculated exclusion, just like the others. He stared at the screen, his jaw locked, hand hovering over the mouse. The weight of what he was holding wasn't just emotional now. It was evidence. He printed one page, the summary index. Just one. He folded it, placed it into a drawer beside Delora's original letter, and sat back in his chair. He didn't speak that night. But inside him, something hardened. The next day, Harmonix released a new statement, trying to reaffirm their commitment to inclusive community partnerships. They tagged Shaq's foundation. He didn't repost. He didn't reply. He simply posted one photo on his own account. A shot of the Darius mural in Low Ridge. Kids painting beside it. The caption read, "Truth doesn't need polish." The post went viral within hours. Inside Harmonix, panic brewed. Talon held a closed-door session with legal, trying to determine whether any employee could have leaked files. No names came up. But that didn't matter. The giant was moving. And this time, he wasn't smiling. The files from the USB sat like a quiet fire on his desk. Each entry confirmed what Delora's letter had hinted, what Kendra Vale had admitted, and what the whispers in the corners of the internet were beginning to suspect. Shaq knew the truth was no longer a theory. It was a system documented and dressed in the language of professionalism. But truth without amplification would still be ignored. He needed a voice that the system couldn't mute. So he called Becca Rames. Becca had once been the rising star of independent investigative journalism, sharp-minded, relentless, a voice that cracked through sleek PR narratives like a crowbar through glass. But 3 years ago, she'd been blacklisted after running an expose on a billion-dollar real estate firm, laundering donations through nonprofit shells. She'd been right, but the price was her platform. She now ran a low-budget channel on a forgotten corner of the internet, surviving on donations and freelance editing gigs. When Shaqs Foundation reached out through a burner contact, she didn't believe it at first. Then a second message came with an audio note. "I have a story. It's not about me. It's about the people they tried to erase using my name. I'm not looking for a headline. I'm looking for a reckoning. If you're still about truth, call me." She called back within the hour. Their first meeting was off-grid, at a quiet diner 2 towns over from the Harmonics Tower. No handlers, no press, just 2 people who understood that institutions only fear what they can't spin. Shaq slid the folder across the table. Becca flipped through it, her face unreadable. She stopped on one entry. "D. Price. That's the cleaner. She's the spark." Shaq said, "But the story's bigger. It's a pattern, buried under image management." Becca tapped the edge of the paper. "You're telling me a multi-billion-dollar firm has been categorizing human beings under visual compliance and using you as cover. I'm telling you I helped build the walls without knowing who they kept out." Becca didn't blink. "Then let's tear the walls down." What followed was a quiet operation wrapped in urgency. Becca assembled a small, trusted crew. 2 editors, 1 cinematographer, and a legal consultant, working pro bono. They moved fast but silent, not alerting the press, not tipping the system. Shaq gave them everything. Emails, scanned reports, personal commentary. But he didn't want to be the center. "This ain't a redemption arc," he told them. "It's a record." Becca asked one thing before filming began: to meet Delora. Shaq made the call personally. Delora was hesitant at first. She'd been pushed out, then forgotten, then pulled back into a spotlight she never asked for. But when Becca showed her the footage, the logs, the names of 11 others, she nodded slowly. "If it helps them see the machine, I'll speak." Becca filmed her interview in a single take, no edits. Delora didn't perform. She recalled her son, her shift that day, the moment she saw Shaq, the way her name vanished from the schedule, the way silence came, not as a surprise, but as a routine. Then came the series, Wiped Away, a 4-part digital documentary released exclusively through Becca's channel and cross-posted through anonymous community servers. No ads, no sponsors, just truth. The opening episode, The Smile That Cost Her Everything, went live on a Thursday at 7 p.m. By midnight it had been viewed 1.3 million times. The internet lit up. Activists amplified it. Former Harmonics employees started sharing their own stories in comment threads. Hashtags began trending. Brand risk, wiped away, and cleaned out all surged. News anchors who had once dismissed Becca called her back for interviews. She declined most. "Let the series speak," she said, and it did. Within 2 days, Harmonix's corporate page was flooded with public scrutiny. Shareholders began demanding answers. Sponsors pulled out of pending deals. Talon Briggs responded with a weapon he trusted: optics. He called for a press conference. It was staged in the Harmonix lobby, glass walls, branded banners, perfectly diverse staff, arranged in the background. He stood at a podium, practiced and pristine. "We at Harmonix take inclusion seriously. The recent online allegations are troubling, and we are conducting a full internal review. We believe in our mission and in continuous growth. We also value our partnerships, including our ongoing admiration for Mr. O'Neill and the communities we serve." He paused, waiting for the usual nods, the planted claps, the standard performance. That's when Shaq walked into the room. No security detail, no announcement, just presence. The room stilled. He walked slowly down the center aisle, every eye following him, every camera redirecting. Talon froze but quickly recovered with a PR smile. Shaq didn't take the podium. He didn't shake hands. He stood beside the cameras, looked directly into one of them, and spoke. Not loud, not angry, just real. "You cleaned her out," he said, voice calm. "Now we're cleaning house. No spin. No metaphor. Just 6 words that cracked the entire narrative. Talon's smile faltered. Reporters erupted with questions. Are you severing ties with Harmonix? Do you believe the allegations? What did you know and when? Shaq raised a hand. I don't need to shout, he said. The documents are real. The stories are real. I lent my name thinking I was lifting people up. Turns out, they were stepping on folks while I smiled for the camera. That's over. He turned and left. Just like that. The footage went live in less than an hour. Across every major network, headlines changed. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a shift. Delora's name, once a line in a dismissal report, now stood as a symbol. So did the others. Their names were featured in the final episode of the series, not as victims but as witnesses to a structure designed to disappear people. Within days, Harmonix's stock dipped. Their press team issued 2 more vague statements. But it didn't matter. The public had already chosen its story. And Shaq, the giant who had waited quietly, had delivered a message no company script could rewrite. Talon Briggs, still trying to hold the narrative together, called an emergency executive meeting. On paper, it was to address the wave of false and defamatory claims. Behind the scenes, he was preparing to make a singular offer, one that could put the genie back in the bottle. Delora Price. The narrative revolved around her. The letter, the story, the voice in the documentary that shook the public. If he could control that one thread, the rest could be reframed. He sent a courier to her home in Lowridge. No email, no traceable record. Inside the envelope was a letter from Harmonix Legal, offering a lump sum settlement of $140,000 in exchange for her silence. The agreement included a non-disclosure clause and a full waiver of claims against the company. It also included language carefully crafted to seem kind. We acknowledge the pain you've experienced and wish to support your continued healing. Delora read it once. Then again. She folded it, set it down on the table next to a small photo of Darius, and made a call. When she arrived at Becca's office, she wasn't shaken or uncertain. She walked in with the envelope and laid it on the desk like evidence. They think this will make me disappear again, she said. But I've already been invisible once. That's not happening twice. Becca gave a slow, quiet nod. We don't move, unless you say so. I say we move, Delora replied. 2 days later, Delora became the lead plaintiff in a civil action against Harmonix Corporation, a class action suit alleging racial discrimination, wrongful termination, and systemic cultural bias masked by policy language. The suit was filed by Stanton and Bell, a fierce but lesser-known legal team, with a record of biting into corporate giants. Their fees were fully covered by a fund that no one traced publicly, but Shaq's foundation staff referred to it quietly as the Darius Endowment. The suit was not only valid, it was loaded. Depositions began piling in. The internal documents Jace Mercer had forwarded, now authenticated and verified, served as the backbone of the case. Visual compliance charts, race-coded employee notes and metadata showing patterns across multiple years became irrefutable proof that this was not human error. It was design. Inside Harmonix, panic hardened into paralysis. Internal PR scrambled to control the narrative. New faces were brought to the front. A community inclusion panel was formed overnight and paraded across media. But no one was listening. People had already seen the truth, and the system's facelift was too late. Talon watched it all unfold from his high-rise office, his control slipping like sand through closed fists. He couldn't stop the news cycle. Couldn't unsay Shaq's 6 words. Couldn't unplay Delora's recorded voice. Every tool he'd once used, optics, contracts, strategic silence, was now weaponized against him. Worse still, he was beginning to lose the board. Kendra Vale, once the silent dissenter, had grown louder. After years of towing the company line, she had finally turned her quiet observations into open action. She called for independent audits. She requested a review of Talon's hiring patterns, citing clear statistical disparities. Investors took notice. Her confidence didn't just come from morality, it came from leverage. Because truth had a rhythm now, and it was picking up speed. Meanwhile, the public watched in real time as a story about a single woman cleaning floors became a movement of remembered names. Former Harmonix staff began speaking publicly, not just to Becca's channel, but to major outlets, podcasts, YouTube panels, think pieces, each story different in detail, but identical in consequence. The quiet push-out, the erasure, the discomfort with their presence justified as brand concern. as if their very existence had been too loud for the halls they cleaned and walked. Shaq stayed mostly silent through it all, but his presence loomed over every headline. He didn't need to speak again. His absence from Harmonic's platform spoke louder than any formal condemnation. Then came the most powerful moment yet. In a special live stream panel titled Echoes Unburied, Becca hosted Delora alongside 3 former Harmonix employees, each one representing a different layer of the corporate ladder. A janitor, a front desk associate, a project analyst. At one point, the analyst said something that stopped the conversation cold. "I used to process monthly retention reports. I saw the list of who left, why. I once joked with a colleague, we could chart a pattern here. He told me, don't." Delora looked into the camera. "They said I crossed a line by asking for an autograph," she said, voice steady. "But the line had already been drawn around me long before that. I just stepped through it." The comments section exploded. So did media coverage. The suit gained additional co-plaintiffs. Civil rights watchdogs offered support. HR policy watchdogs issued statements of concern. A movement was no longer brewing. It had landed, and through it all, Shaq kept building. More funding, more centers, more names on walls. Every person erased became a part of the structure. A plaque, a tribute, a scholarship. The system that once filtered people out was now becoming a mirror, and it showed everything Harmonix tried to hide. Because when image becomes a lie, it only takes one honest voice to break the screen. The boardroom on the 58th floor of Harmonix Corporate Plaza had never been this full, but it had never felt this quiet either. The long mahogany table, polished to a sterile gleam, stretched across the room like a runway for power. At one end sat Kendra Vale, calm but unblinking, a leather-bound folder in front of her filled with petitions, testimony and proof. At the opposite end sat Talon Briggs, flawless as ever in a charcoal suit, tapping a silver pen against his notepad like it was a metronome for control. And near the back of the room, in a chair not meant for guests, sat Shaquille O'Neal. No entourage, no notepad, just presence. To his left was Delora Price, quietly composed. To his right, Jace Mercer, hands folded tightly, the edges of his copied files peeking from a manila folder on his lap. They weren't there to speak. They were there to witness. The motion on the table was simple in text but thunderous in consequence. A vote of no confidence in Executive VP Talon Briggs. The justification was detailed, citing evidence of racially biased termination practices, manipulation of internal compliance logs, and the strategic silencing of dissent through procedural intimidation. But beneath the legal phrasing, everyone in the room knew the motion was about something deeper. Integrity. And whether Harmonix still had any left. Kendra began the proceedings without showmanship. Her voice didn't waver, nor did she raise it. She listed the patterns of terminations, the coded language of brand risk, the suppressed complaints. She laid out the full context of the lawsuit now active against the company, the fallout from Wiped Away, the financial backlash that was snowballing. Then she handed out printed statements from former employees. These stories were filtered out of our inboxes, buried in locked files, treated as liabilities, instead of signals. We can't claim to value our people while our systems are engineered to erase them. Talon smirked slightly as she spoke, the kind of smile people wear when they believe nothing's really changed. He waited until she finished before rising, adjusting his cufflinks with slow, theatrical precision. "I respect the emotion in the room," he began, clearly rehearsed. "But we're talking about perception, not policy. Our brand is under attack by external agitators, with emotional leverage and manipulated narratives. We need consistency, not collapse. I've protected Harmonix from instability, and that's what I'll continue to do. That's what leadership looks like." He sat back down, confident, almost smug. Silence followed. Then the board members began casting their votes, each one verbal, deliberate, echoing slightly off the high ceiling. Again. 4. Against. 4. The count edged forward, tension braided into every second. Talon shifted in his seat, eyes flicking toward the CFO, his usual ally, who hesitated longer than expected before softly saying, "Now it was 5-4. Talon locked eyes with the final 2 undecideds, both mid-level board members, rarely vocal, always voting with the flow. But today the flow had changed. One of them, a man named Clay, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in 5 years of meetings, looked down at the printout in front of him, then toward Delora. Their eyes met for only a second, but it was enough. 4. Talon straightened, jaw tight. The final vote came seconds later. 4, 6 to 5. Motion passed. No applause. No outbursts. Just a long, cold silence that wrapped itself around the room. Talon stood up, more slowly this time. The pen in his hand was still. He glanced around at faces that used to belong to his power network, and now only looked away. Even those who voted for him didn't speak. He gathered his folder, adjusted his suit coat, and turned toward the door. As he reached the threshold, a voice stopped him. Shock. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't stand. He just said 5 words. You used my face wrong. Talon didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. He walked out into the hallway, alone. Downstairs, the press knew nothing yet. The world would hear about the vote in due time. But inside the room, something had shifted that would last longer than headlines. Kendra turned to Shaq. He nodded once. Delora reached for the folder Jace still held, and she placed it on the table where Talon had just been sitting. There were no more secrets in that room. Only the echo of what happens when silence stops serving power and starts serving justice. Inside the main hallway, lining the walls of the entry corridor, were painted portraits. Not of celebrities, not of executives, but of people, workers, staff, names once buried in employee logs. There was Jerome, the mailroom lead, Tanya from building services, Raphael from maintenance, faces with stories behind them, now staring back at the world with quiet dignity. Each one had a brass plate beneath it that simply read, erased, now remembered. Delora hadn't said a word at first, just stood, hands pressed to her sides like someone afraid to touch the light in front of them. Now, as the event began, she felt the heaviness shift, not vanish but become shared. Kendra Vale opened the ceremony with a few short remarks, thanking the city and acknowledging the volunteers. Then she stepped back and nodded toward the podium. Shaq motioned for Delora. She hesitated. The crowd quieted, and slowly, she stepped forward. She didn't carry notes. She didn't unfold a speech. She just looked at the people, young and old, suits and sneakers, reporters and neighbors, and spoke. I spent 21 years cleaning buildings I couldn't afford to sit down in. I used to think silence was safer than truth. That if I kept my head down, maybe I'd keep my place. But the truth is, I never really had a place. I was borrowed. Conditional. Meant to be forgotten. She paused. They fired me for asking a question that mattered to me. But they built a system where people like me never got to ask anything at all. A long breath. The kind that signals a shift. People ask why I didn't take their money. Why I didn't sign that NDA. Why I didn't move on. And it's simple. Because if cleaning floors is beneath you, then rising up shouldn't be allowed either. The crowd went silent. Some nodded. Some wiped their eyes. You want a clean image? She continued. Start by cleaning your conscience. Shaq stepped forward then, not to take the mic, but to lift the cloth covering the wall mural. The canvas fell away. Painted in bold strokes, stretching across the side of the building, was a 2-person portrait, Shaq and Delora, standing shoulder to shoulder. But what made it striking wasn't the size or color, it was the expressions. They weren't smiling, they were looking forward. Eyes level, calm, real. At the bottom of the mural, the artist had painted words that weren't from any press release. They were Delora's, spoken from the stage. Erased doesn't mean gone, it just means we had to find our own wall. The muralist, a young local named Haven, had painted it live that morning, finishing it just as the event began. Every brushstroke had been deliberate, and watching Delora see herself not as the forgotten, but as the face of change, brought tears to more than a few eyes in the crowd. Children from the neighborhood ran up to her afterward, some with sketchbooks, some with smartphones, all wanting to be near the woman whose voice had started something real. Delora bent down to greet every one of them. No hurry, no discomfort. This was her floor now. Inside the center, tours began. The Lucille House wasn't just a building, it was a blueprint. Part education hub, part employment incubator, part story archive. One room featured a digital wall where people could upload stories of workplace silencing from anywhere in the country. Another room had a circular space with audio booths, where former workers could record their stories in their own voice. Nothing about the center felt like charity. It felt like accountability turned into architecture. Jace stood near the recording room, watching quietly. He didn't speak much that day, just kept a folded note in his back pocket, The one Delora had mailed originally, now signed by Shaq and framed beside the main office. On the bottom, Jace had written one sentence: "Let no truth be lost again." As the sun began to lower, casting a gold wash over the mural, Shaq sat on a bench outside, with his mother, Lucille O'Neill, who had made the trip for the opening. She looked at the building, her name in bold above the doors, and smiled. "Didn't think I'd ever see a center with my name on it," she said. "You earned it," Shaq replied. "You taught me what matters." Lucille nodded slowly. "That girl, Delora. She reminds me of me. Quiet, but powerful. She's louder than all of us now," he said, watching as Delora walked toward the parking lot, a small crowd still around her. Lucille turned to him. "You gave her a platform." Shaq shook his head. "No," he said. "She gave me a reason." That night, as the last guests trickled away and the mural dried under the street lamps, Delora stood once more in front of the wall. She touched her painted image, not with awe, but with something deeper: acceptance. Then she turned and walked to her car, not as a footnote in someone else's story, but as a chapter all her own. Talon Briggs sat in a room without windows. The glow of his desk lamp cast a small, controlled circle of light over the bland office cubicle, the kind lined with fabric walls meant to absorb noise and identity. A nameplate that once gleamed on a mahogany door now read, "Briggs, Admin Analyst," slapped in vinyl on a standard-issue gray divider. There were no meetings to lead, no team under him, no calls to command the room. His email signature no longer triggered replies within seconds. Now he was lucky to get a noted before close of business. This wasn't a fall from grace. It was worse. It was the slow, grinding erosion of relevance. The company that hired him after Harmonix had done so, out of discretion, not admiration, a mid-sized consulting firm, looking to fill a metrics position for back-end data compliance. They didn't care about his past, only that it was behind him. Talon didn't speak of Harmonix. No one asked. Everyone had Googled. Everyone had decided he wasn't worth the risk of discussing. He had gone from curating a brand empire to inputting compliance flags in spreadsheets he didn't author, for systems he didn't design. No one asked his opinion anymore. They asked for formatting. At first, Talon thought he'd rebuild, that he'd find a way back. But as weeks passed, so did the calls, the invites, the illusions. Whatever power he thought was transferable had vanished the moment his silence lost its value. No one feared him, and without fear, Talon was just a man in a cubicle. Each morning began the same. A walk through a lobby, where no one knew his name, past a receptionist who didn't look up, into an elevator that hummed without distinction. There was no recognition now, no greetings in reserved tones, just a blank space where his influence used to be. And the nights were longer. His apartment, once sleek and perched above a skyline of lights, had been exchanged for a smaller unit in a quiet complex on the edge of town. No concierge, no floor-to-ceiling windows, just a small balcony and beige walls. The silence here wasn't chosen, it was left behind. He watched television in fragments. Every time a new story surfaced about the Lucille house, he changed the channel. But it didn't matter. Shaq's face would show up eventually, smiling next to Delora, or standing with kids in rec centers, or walking beside former employees he had helped rehire somewhere else. It was inescapable. Not because it was everywhere, but because Talon had nowhere left to hide. He scrolled through social media, under a burner account, reading threads that used to mention his name, with titles like branding visionary or corporate culture guru. Now when he appeared at all, it was in hashtags that carried words like architect of erasure or face filter fraud. His name had become a cautionary tale. No lawsuits had touched him personally. No criminal charges. Nothing he couldn't technically justify. That was his skill, after all. He'd built a system that protected itself by staying within the lines. But now that the world had learned to read between those lines, he was no longer untouchable, just unnecessary. Across the city on a quiet porch bathed in golden light, Shaq and Lucille O'Neill sat watching the sun dip behind the trees. No words between them, just the rhythm of peace, earned, not owed. A pitcher of tea rested on the table, untouched. The creak of the wooden swing was the only sound. Lucille broke the silence first. "You did good," she said, nodding at the horizon. Shaq tilted his head. "Did enough," she smiled. "That's better than most." They didn't talk about Talon, or Delora, or the Lucille house. They didn't need to. That part of the story had passed through them, through the world, and landed where it needed to land. The rest was up to time. Because that's what Talon never understood. He thought silence was a weapon, something to use to direct, to craft an image too smooth for questions. But silence has a different shape when it's not controlled, when it isn't staged, when it sits after truth, not in place of it. And now, silence was all Talon had left. In his apartment, he turned off the television. The room buzzed with a quiet too still to soothe. He thought of calling someone. No one came to mind. He looked at his phone screen for a long time, thumb hovering over nothing. Then he turned it face down. Outside his window, a child rode by on a bike, a t-shirt flapping in the wind. Shaq's face was on it, above the words "See us now." Talon leaned back in his chair, the ceiling above him blank. The silence pressed in, not violent, not angry, just heavy and familiar. For years he'd curated silence to protect power. Now it was his only companion. And it didn't blink. It was late afternoon, in Low Ridge, and the sun leaned gently across the buildings, casting long golden shadows over the pavement. The streets hummed with a steady lived-in rhythm. Kids on scooters, shop windows open, music pulsing softly from an old stereo perched in a barbershop window. The kind of ordinary peace that once felt like fiction in this part of the city. On the corner of Reed and Marston stood a wide wall stretching the length of an old refurbished warehouse, the outer face of the Lucille house. The mural had become a destination. It was no longer just a piece of public art. It was a story carved in color. A tour group had gathered on the sidewalk, one of the many that now made regular stops on what locals started calling the Truth Trail. A walk through the landmarks where a movement was born. Community centers, old shuttered lots, the former Harmonics Hope facade that had since been transformed into a library annex. But the mural was the final stop, always. Painted across its surface were over 24 portraits now, faces of those once buried in file folders, people pushed out by invisible policies. Their eyes stared back, not with bitterness, but with the fierce stillness of people who had survived being overlooked. At the center, standing side by side, were Delora Price and Shaquille O'Neal, a little girl in the tour group, maybe 8 or 9, wearing a backpack with cartoon stickers on the strap, pointed up at Delora's face, her hand tugged at the guide's sleeve. "Who's that?" The guide smiled.
"That's Delora Price," he said. "She didn't just clean buildings. She changed what clean means."
The girl blinked. "How?" The guide stepped back and gestured toward the mural like it was a page in a book. She told the truth when no one was listening. They tried to erase her, but instead of disappearing, she made them see everyone they'd erased before her. She stood up, and others followed. The girl tilted her head, processing, then looked at the image of Shaq next to Delora, his figure towering but soft, eyes steady. "And him?" she asked. "That's Big Shaq. You probably know him from TV or basketball. But here?" The guide paused. "Here, he's the guy who gave power to the people who never had a mic." The girl nodded slowly, eyes lingering on Delora's painted expression, calm, proud, not posing. She whispered, "She looks like she belongs there." The guide nodded. She always did. Down the block, inside the Lucille house, Delora walked the halls slowly, a cup of coffee in her hand. She wore a gray sweater, simple earrings, and no badge. She didn't need credentials here. She was this place's compass, even if she'd never say so herself. Each room buzzed with quiet purpose. Teens worked in digital labs. Seniors read books to toddlers in the literacy corner. 2 young men painted a canvas with new community members' names. The building had grown from center to heartbeat. It didn't carry Shaq's brand. It carried his intention. At the back of the building, in a room labeled Listening Library, Delora stepped inside. It was her favorite room, lined with sound booths and tablets. It allowed people to listen to stories recorded by those once silenced. A screen displayed a rotating list of names, anonymous and known, each with a 5-minute entry. No flashy design, just voice and truth. She sat at one of the chairs, placed her cup down, and clicked on the latest entry. A woman's voice began, "My name's Tasha. I used to work front desk security. They told me smiling too much made guests uncomfortable. That my tone was over-personal. I didn't even know I was on a warning list until they let me go." The voice paused, but then I watched wiped away. And I saw Delora. And I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew I wasn't alone. Delora closed her eyes and listened. She didn't cry anymore. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had transformed. It had shape now, movement, direction, and it lived in the walls around her. Across town, Shaq walked through the back entrance of a school-turned-arts center, one of the smaller projects funded through his quiet network. He wore a hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. No cameras followed him. He preferred it that way now. The people who mattered already knew he was there. A young man stopped him near the entrance. "Yo, Mr. O'Neill," he said, wide-eyed. "I'm teaching my little cousin how to mix beats in the studio y'all built. He's good, like real good." Shaq grinned. "He's got a good teacher then." The kid laughed, nodded, and jogged down the hall. Shaq wandered into the community recording room, where local students were editing audio for a podcast episode. They paused when they saw him. One of them asked, "You want to say something?" He considered it for a moment, then shook his head. "Nah," he said. "I already said what I needed to. Y'all keep building." He walked out as they nodded in respect, returning to their edits. They weren't starstruck anymore. They were part of the story now, not just watching one. Later that evening, Shaq returned to his mother's porch. Lucille rocked slowly beside him, hands folded over her lap. "You ever think it'd turn into all this?" he asked. Lucille looked at the trees lining the yard. "I thought you'd be big," she said. "But I didn't think you'd be so quiet about it." He chuckled. "You get louder when you ain't trying to prove nothing," she said. They sat in silence, the peaceful kind, the kind earned through hard choices and honest steps. Back in Lowridge, the little girl from the mural tour stood beside the wall after everyone else had walked away. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notepad. She opened it and began to sketch the face of Delora, slowly tracing the features, eyes narrowed in focus. She didn't say a word. She just drew. Down the block, a metal plaque was embedded in the sidewalk. It read, "Legacy isn't carved in stone, it's left in footsteps. Walk with purpose." And around that corner the mural caught the sun just right, making every color look alive. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it settle. Share it with someone who still believes silence is safe. Speak where others have been muted. Build where others were erased. Because the system doesn't change when we watch it. Changes when we refuse to look away.